Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to each one of you, wherever you may be joining us from today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm speaking today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I recognize their enduring connection to the land, the waters, and the community, and their continued contribution to the life of this country. I would also like to acknowledge the individuals behind this important work. Firstly, the research team from the Australian Security Research Centre, whose combined academic and operational expertise has shaped this project. Dr. Gabriel Schneider, the director of the Australian Security Research Centre, who was the project lead and senior researcher, Bella Gibur, who was the project manager and researcher, Dr. Paul Johnston, who was also a project lead and researcher, Joe Saunders, Mark Costello, G. Guriel, as well as Nicole Sofianos. I would also like to acknowledge Janita Zhang for her work in marketing, formatting, and digital design, ensuring this research is not only rigorous, but accessible and impactful. Importantly, I would also like to acknowledge the peer reviewers who brought deep operational and leadership insight into this work. Major General retired Andrew Hocking, a senior military leader with extensive experience in national and international operations and strategic leadership. Dave Owens, a former Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Police and highly experienced crisis and emergency management leader. And Tony Pearce, former Inspector General for the Emergency Management Victoria, and a nationally recognized authority in emergency management and public safety. And finally, I want to acknowledge the survivors, those who experienced this event firsthand, and who, in many cases, anonymously agreed to be interviewed and contribute to this research. That takes courage. Their lived experience is not just part of this report, it is central to it. Today's discussion is grounded in the research paper From Indicators to Action, a security risk and preparedness framework analysis of the Bondi Beach terrorist attack. But I want to be very clear about something from the outset. For many people, this is a case study. For some, it's an academic or professional discussion. For me, my wife, and my 6-year-old child, this was not theoretical. We were there. This is not something we read about later in the media or we watched unfold on the news. This was real, unfolding around us in real time. And for many others, those who were there physically, those connected to it, those who lost someone, this was not an incident. It was a moment that changed lives forever. We need to call it what it was. This was the worst terrorist attack in Australia's history. And it happened less than 4 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now. So today is not just about analysis. It is not just about frameworks or findings. It's about people. I want to take a moment to honor those who lost their lives, to acknowledge the families, the friends, and the communities who are still carrying that loss every single day. There are no words that can make that acceptable, but there is responsibility in how we respond. I also want to pay tribute to the many brave individuals, both in official roles and those simply found themselves there, who stepped forward in the face of unimaginable circumstances. First responders, security personnel, members of the public, people who faced what for many would be their worst nightmare come true. And instead of turning away, they moved toward it. They answered the call for help. They did what they could do to save lives. And where they couldn't, they provided comfort, humanity, and presence in moments of chaos and fear. That matters. And it should not be taken for granted. The research does something important. It does not speak to assign blame. It does not simplify what is inherently complex. Instead, it asks the critical question: how do we move from knowing to doing? Because one of the most confronting realities highlighted in this work is that risk was not invisible. There were indicators, there were signals, there was awareness. And yet, awareness alone is not preparedness, and preparedness does not guarantee action. The gap between what we know and what we actually do is where outcomes are shaped. And that is where this conversation needs to focus. In a world that is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and digitized, we cannot afford to be purely reactive. We need to be thinking differently. We need to act earlier. We need to connect intelligence to action more effectively. And we need to empower people, not just systems, to make decisions under pressure. That is what today is about. This is an opportunity not to revisit the tragedy for its own sake, but to ensure that what was experienced, what was lost, and what was learned leads to better outcomes for the future. So as we move into this discussion, I encourage all of us to listen with intent, to reflect honestly, and to think about what this means in your context. Because ultimately, the goal here is simple: to move from indicators to action. We're now going to move into the first part of today's session, where we'll hear directly from the individuals who led and contributed to this research, each bringing a different lens to their analysis. And I'll welcome our first guest onto the panel, Dr. Gabriel Schneider. Dr. Gabriel Schneider is the project lead and senior researcher and director of the Australian Security Research Centre. Gab, I'm going to throw it to you first to set the context of this research paper. What drove you to do this research and what you hope it achieves?
Thanks, Dave. And, thank you everyone for joining us as we talk through what was a really complex and comparatively difficult project to lead and put a research paper together on. Fundamentally for us, bad things happen, and very often we want to find one root cause, one person to blame, one excuse. But realistically, in the world we're in, as Dave, you mentioned so well, it's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, digitized. It's very rarely just one thing. And while we acknowledge and are very grateful that we've got a Royal Commission looking into social cohesion, anti-Semitism, and some of the causal factors around this attack, we also felt that there were so many aspects that are crucial to the security function, both from detection, deterrence, and response and recovery, that might not have been covered. We also have the benefit of being an independent research center, which enables us to move fast, target experts to contribute, and look at things from not just an academic perspective, but also from a practitioner and thought leader perspective. So our goal with this study is not purely academic. While we wanted to ensure that we have a study that passes academic rigor, we wanted to start to raise some questions where we would actually look at what are we doing, why are we doing it, how are we doing it, and is it achieving the results that we need? Simplistically, as we look at the study and we look at what actually happened, it's incredibly worrying and concerning to note that we've had several years post-COVID where we've seen an increase in generic violence, generic bad behavior, generic aggression in places like Australia and other first world countries. But if you overlay this, since we look at what happened in Israel on October 7, and we look at the fallout and the damage to social cohesion since that date, it's easy in hindsight to see the causal indicators and where we landed. The question comes down to what do we do differently now? And I think that part is fundamentally important. As we explore the findings of the report, we start looking at what do we do. One of the worst things we could do as a society is just continue to do the same. The challenge with something like a Royal Commission is we've got at least 7 or 8 months to wait before any findings come through. The threat situation right now has not really changed. If anything, it's consistent and possibly getting worse based on international occurrences, based on people getting desperate, due to cost of living and fuel shortages. So if we actually look at what we need to be doing now, it's not just allocating blame and trying to hold one party responsible. It's looking at those little things that we can change to make things better, to reduce the likelihood of violence occurring, to increase the opportunities for us to detect, deter, and prevent bad things from happening. But equally, we need to look at the response and recovery phases too. When something terrible like a terrorist attack happens, we see the best and the worst of people. We see horrible behavior with people who are fueled with hate and their primary objective, as per the variables that tend to be accepted when we look at defining terrorism. Generally, the idea is to inflict as much harm and damage at an intended audience or target group based on political or ideological motivation, okay, with the aim to cause fear and influence an audience. We need to be very, very careful as a society that we don't let terrorism win and we don't let hate win. But equally, that won't happen just by good sentiment. We need to look at the way we apply security in practice. We need to look at the way we work together. So if we look at the way private security, for example, collaborates with the police, if we look at the way our national security agencies provide information and insight so that we can be more prepared, if we look at the way event organizers apply things like the crowded places strategy, if we look at the way individuals plan for how they'd respond to a worst case scenario, all of us have a role to play in making a safer Australia. And in closing with my opening, my firm hope is that if you're a security or risk expert, that you look at the report and you think about what do we need to change in order to be ready for what is happening today, not just what happened yesterday. And equally, what's going to happen tomorrow, not based on what we were comfortable with in the past, but based on where we are and where we're going. And unfortunately for many, many practitioners in this field, the challenges are immense. It's not easy to secure complex situations. It's not easy to respond to violence. Dave, in your opening, you celebrated the first responders. It's not easy to run towards gunfire. It's not easy to run towards a bloody situation. But realistically, we have to prepare for, in all likelihood, more of these things happening. And ideally, we don't just want to be prepared, we want to prevent them. We want to learn, we want to be more equipped to handle them if they do happen. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is to take an open, honest look at what works and what doesn't. And then start looking at how we can change some of these things over time. I'm sure there'll be many questions that will come up. Thank you, Dave, for the opportunity to open.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks again for your commitment and dedication to making Australia a better place from lessons learned in a proactive manner. Dave Owens, I'd like to bring you in and thank you for giving of your time to join us, not only to peer review this important piece of work, but your insights and actions had a significant impact on the outcome of this paper, right? So, Dave, as I mentioned earlier, former Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Police and one of the peer reviewers on this report, you bring a deep operational and crisis management experience. What stood out for you from a policing and operational standpoint?
Thanks, Dave, and welcome everyone to this afternoon. As Dave said, I looked at it differently. I looked at it from a law enforcement, but also an emergency management lens. So I wasn't interested in the blame game, and Gav said that already. The attribution of blame was not what it was about. This was about adopting a systems perspective rather than that blame focus, and that's appropriate when you're analysing complex security events. You've got to examine the threat recognition, the preparedness posture, and the operational response, how they all interacted, and the study contributes meaningfully to understanding of the systemic performance rather than individual decision making, and that's really important. So it effectively situates the incident within the broader strategic threat environment. That includes rising anti-Semitism, social polarisation, and the challenges of interpreting diffuse warning signals. And we'll come back to that later, I'm sure, in the discussion. So This contextualization enhances the credibility of the analysis, but it also helps to explain the structural conditions under which preparedness system operates. It provided a practical and policy relevant insights, particularly in relation to crowded place protection doctrine. One of the biggest things, and Gav mentioned it, been on about it for years, this relationship with public-private security and the coordination of how that occurs, and the execution phase of disruption during attacks. It's a reform pathway table that was in there with the structured findings. It translates the analysis into actual actionable considerations for policymakers, but also practitioners. So the report also was transparent and it was appropriately cautioned. It took a cautious approach and it clearly identified the limitations on classified and restricted information. And that's really important because that strengthens the integrity of the analysis. And finally, it introduced maybe not a new concept, but certainly a new concept in Australia, which is this sequence disruption in the execution of phased attacks, which provides useful framework. What I would say is there's watershed moments that all countries, agencies and governments have. This, I hope, was a watershed moment. It's a shame. It's terrible that people lost their lives at it, but there were dots on the wall, but everybody was looking at the dots individually. Somebody needed to actually step back and connect those dots to see what the bigger picture is, and I think this report does that. What worries me is the large majority of Australians have now gone back to how we were before the event because we love the Australian way of life and that, but it's almost as if nothing happened. We're just going on and getting on with our lives. Whereas I don't think we need to wait 7 months or 9 months for a Royal Commission to tell us some of the issues. I think this report definitely does that. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. And just a few important points there to pick up on. To quote one of the other peer reviewers who I think mentioned is about 250 kilometers paddling down the Margaret at the moment, mentioned that one of the greatest losses that we have in events like this is when organizations and when authorities and when entities will look to assign blame rather than to take lessons and build resilience and build improvement and build learnings from. So I think that that's a very, very important point there as well. And to your second point, we need to get across the fact that the world has fundamentally changed. I've had many discussions over the last couple of years where people have said, you know, this place is not the same as it was. Nowhere in the world is the same as it was. So therefore, we can't behave in the same manner that it used to be. So really relevant points there, Dave. Bella, if I could bring you into the discussion now. Bella, you led key elements of this research around intelligence, threat indicators, risk awareness, and the rise of anti-Semitism. Take us through some of the key insights that you found from your analysis.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll probably pull out three key insights from the analysis. So first, it's important to notice that this was not an isolated incident. The Bondi Beach attack really needs to be understood in the context of a much broader and increasingly volatile environment, particularly the surge in anti-Semitic incidents we've seen since October 2023. And it's not just more incidents, this is a shift in the nature of them, from lower level harassment to much more serious ideologically driven violence. Second, this also really challenges how we traditionally think about threat. The attackers didn't neatly fit into a typical terrorism profile, meaning that there was no clear affiliation or obvious ideological label. And that's really important because it shows that those traditional frameworks not only take us so far. What matters more now is looking at patterns of behavior, so things like escalation, grievance, and targeting, rather than just asking, what ideology is this? And third, violence like this doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's shaped by the environment around it. So if you look historically, anti-Semitism tends to intensify during periods of social stress or geopolitical tension, and we're seeing that play out again. However, what's different now is how online spaces and broader networks are amplifying that hostility, and in some cases lowering the threshold for people to act. So for me, I'd say the big takeaway is that if we're serious about prevention, we need to get better at recognizing early signals and broader risk conditions, not just waiting until something clearly fits a terrorism label. Thanks, Dave.
Awesome takeaways there, Bella. And I think that, one of the ways to summarize that statement is we need to be making ourselves comfortably uncomfortable. Our comfort zone is not a place where growth happens. It's not a place where change happens. And it's a place where, unfortunately, mistakes happen. Let's move into a panel discussion now. So I'm going to invite all the panelists up onto the stage just to have a bit of a discussion around some key themes and key points. While we're having this discussion, I'm going to extend an invitation to you, the audience, to please send your questions through on the Q&A. Kick off the discussion. Gav, I want to ask you a quick question here. The report highlights a clear gap between risk awareness and action, as we've spoken about. So from this proactive opportunistic resilience perspective, what are the most practical shifts organizations would need to be taking to close this gap?
Thanks, Dave. So to kind of get that piece started, let's just think of three ideas, right? Ignorance, negligence, and denial are usually the three things or the three excuses that an organization or a group of individuals come up with to not do something. So ignorance, I don't want to know about it, it's not my problem. Negligence, I know better, but I don't want to spend the money or take the effort. And denial, it won't happen to me. So the starting point is we actually need to tackle all three of those things. We need to be looking in a informed way at what the threat picture actually looks like, not what it was pre-COVID, not what we wish it was, and understand that, as per ASIO guidance, this idea of fruit salad ideology, where potentially we can't comfortably, as Bella said, put somebody just in a box based on, I support ISIS or I support Al-Qaeda, or I'm a Hezbollah-driven terrorist, or I'm a neo-Nazi. One of the scary things we're seeing now is that we're finding violent people are being attracted to causes that enable them to perpetrate violence, not just people with causes who are conducting violence because of the cause. And we have a massive challenge because we've set a framework where this sort of behavior is potentially acceptable. So I think one of the biggest things we can do to start is just to accept the fact that this can happen, it has happened, and it's likely to happen again if we don't do things differently. What do we mean by doing things differently? If you look at the field of criminology, there are thousands of different studies that will tell you this part is important, or that part is important, or this part is more important than that part. Realistically, we've got a lot of methodology, we've got a lot of practice in how to secure events, how to secure functions, how to create safe places, regardless of the threat. We are also lucky that we have really well-equipped law enforcement capability in this country compared to many other countries. What we have to realize is that we are not in a world where we have endless resources. Okay, so there's not an endless amount of cops. There's not an endless amount of private security. There's not an endless amount of security, risk, and threat expertise out there. But there is no excuse anymore for ignorance, negligence, and denial. It's happened. It will likely happen again. What you do about it for your organization, for yourself, is what counts. And to close off on that, start small. Start with yourself. Think, me and my family, if I was in a place where something bad happened, where could I hide? Where could I run? If I had to protect myself and my family, what would I do to protect them? And from there, if you run an event or you host a large gathering, start understanding the vulnerabilities that event might have. And then we can start looking at what we can do to mitigate, stop, or prevent or deter attacks. As Dave mentioned earlier, one of the other things the research showed us, and this is quite an important change since the October 7 attacks, is that committed attackers might not be deterred by conventional deterrence. So simply having police, having security there, having fencing, having cameras in what I would call an earlier era, that would have often been referred to as enough. Right now, we've got to be thinking, if there's a committed attacker that's willing to trade their life for the ability to kill others, how do we deter them up front? But if we can't deter them, how do we disrupt them? And if we look at any of the crowded places methodology, we know time and movement equals casualties. So the quicker I can stop the attacker and the less movement we can give the attacker, which both of which are disruption ideas, the more lives we save. So we shouldn't just be thinking about how do we tick the boxes in a manual anymore, or how do I follow a process. We want to be thinking about what do we do as well if those things weren't successful and something bad does actually happen. And not just from a compliance perspective of ticking the box, we want to actually understand, will this stuff work for real? Because, to your point, while we're talking about the Bondi Beach terrorist attack, just a few months before that, we had the Bondi Junction attack, which was, a totally different attack driven by a different ideology, but still a random act of violence committed by somebody whose intent was to do the maximum amount of harm. There was very little concern for their physical well-being. And we're seeing this globally, not just in Australia. Thanks, Dave.
And Gav, just a couple of important points that you raised there, and it's what I refer to quite often. ASIO have raised the terrorist alert level in Australia, and they did this some time ago from possible to probable, which is a 50% or greater chance that a terrorist attack will happen in Australia within the next 12 months. The important thing to realize is that not only did it happen, but just because it's happened, it doesn't mean to say that it won't happen again. It's probably increased the likelihood of it happening. So we need to be aware of that. And the other key takeaway I want to take from that, Gav, is what you mentioned, what we refer to as the whole of person model, is all of these things that we do as individuals, not only from an organizational perspective, focus on our work life, our personal life, and our virtual life. So the better we use these skills and these tools in all three of those spheres, the better we get at using them, and the more resilient and ultimately resilient and proactive we become. But anyway, let's carry on. Dave, I want to bring you into the conversation. You alluded to it in your introduction very briefly, but I'd like to unpack this a little bit more with you. Where do you see the biggest friction happening between intelligence and operational action on the ground?
Look, I think your system isn't blind moving forward. Your system's actually saturated. There is that much intelligence that is out there, but I guess you call it a low specificity signal. So it's not a lack of intelligence, but you're getting all this intelligence at a lower level. So what agencies are focusing on is they're operating in an elevated threat environment without an actionable specificity. So in other words, what they're doing is it creates a structural tension. If I escalate too early, the appropriateness of that is disproportionate because they've gone too early. If they escalate too late, it's going to be criticized in hindsight. So it's so difficult when your signal versus your threshold gap, and that's what we're talking about, is what you're being told, where your risk is. The intelligence indicates risk, but there's actually just not enough to justify operational intervention because, as Gav said, you've got finite resources in the police. It costs with private security, and people are trying to do the right thing and have events and keep them going. But it all costs a massive amount of money. So, and what happens is in our legal doctrine as well, which comes in, and the constraints is our model is centralized and it's threshold dependent. So action generally requires observant behavior, not just a concern. I had a concern because in this instance, it was a Jewish event. I had a concern because it was at Bondi Beach, which is an iconic beach. I had a concern because of all the past events that are culminating and building up. It's still a concern. It's not an observable behavior. So whilst the risk is recognised, sometimes that risk doesn't convert across to resourcing, posture and presence. And that's the difficulty that these agencies have got to work in.
And I think, Dave, so much of that, and we'll talk to that a little bit later if we hopefully get some time to, but so much of that relates to culture of the environment. And I suppose that used intuition, circling back to what Gab was saying in the very beginning, those tools that we have in intuition, in living in South Africa, where crime is the order of the day, predominantly opportunistic crime is the order of the day. There were actually posters on street poles, street lamps, and the posters, all they said was, if you've looked twice, call it in. So something has activated your spidey senses, something has activated your intuition that has determined that it's abnormal. Call it in. But to your point, it's that awkward balance between too much, too little, not enough, and just getting that balance right. Bella, if I could bring you into the conversation now. Part of your analysis highlighted a significant rise in anti-Semitic incidents leading into this attack. From a risk intelligence perspective, how should organizations be interpreting and act on these types of societal signals to meaningfully adjust their preparedness posture? And that really links back to what Gav was speaking to earlier in the fruit salad ideology that ASIO speaks of.
Yeah, and I think this is where risk intelligence really needs to evolve, because the key point is that these societal signals are not just background noise, they're actually leading indicators. So I'd probably break it down into 3 practical shifts organizations need to make, with the first one being that they need to treat societal trends as operationally relevant. So a surge in anti-Semitic incidents isn't just a social issue, it's a direct indicator of a changing threat environment. That should trigger things like revisiting threat assessments, reassessing exposure, and asking, are we more at risk today than we were 3 months ago? Second, it would also be about focusing on patterns, not isolated events. One incident on its own might not trigger action, but when you see escalation in severity, repetition, and symbolic targeting, that's a strong signal that risk is intensifying, and that should start to drive decisions early around security posture. And thirdly, I'd say organizations need to shift from reactive to anticipatory thinking. If you wait until something clearly meets a terrorism threshold, you're already behind. So the value is in acting earlier. When you see things like building, escalating, and becoming normalized, and then adjusting your posture before it tips over into something more serious. The bottom line is preparedness isn't just about responding to confirmed threats, but rather interpreting the environment early enough to adjust before those threats fully materialize.
Thanks, Bella. Great insights. And so there's some awesome questions coming through as well. I'm going to pause what I had planned because I think it's more pertinent to get to what the audience wants to hear first. Daryl Shepherd's asked the question, Dave, I'm going to throw this one to you first because the next one's an absolute cracker that, Gav, I want your take on. But Dave, I'm going to throw it to you first. And Daryl's asked the question, what are your thoughts on the aspect of siloing necessary information across different agencies and the impact that it had on this event? Furthermore, what are your thoughts on preventing the usual pendulum swing the other way, as was seen in the US of 9/11?
Yeah, look, great question, Daryl. You can talk on this one for ages, but I won't. I'll be really short. I don't think you should ever silo information. The information, the intelligence is there for everybody to use. And that's what I said about dots on the wall. It'll be that missing dot that somebody is standing back looking at the picture and they go, bang, there's my piece of intelligence that links everything together. We should be making that information freely available to all intelligence agencies, police forces. And I would go further that when you're doing event briefings and this goes to another thing with private security and the enhancement, is you should include them in your pre-briefings. They become part of your team. We're very reticent to do that. They should understand the environment they're operating in. Who do they go to if they need an immediate response? Where do they go to if they need an immediate response? And what is their actual role? So share that intelligence across. Look, we see pendulum swings all the time is the other thing. We go too easy on things. We go too hard on things. It's a terrible saying. We're Aussie, so we like things pretty easy. We're not in that world anymore. If we live and we look at what we're living in, it's not like it used to be. The Australian way has changed, and I think we need a bit of a reality check. We've had that reality check as far as I'm concerned. But as I said at the start, I think everybody has taken a deep breath, stepped back and gone, let's just get back to normal, what we were before the event. And that's not the way it should be done. Absolutely not. Was I surprised firearms were used? Yes, I was. I was surprised they weren't mimicking overseas experience and what they did over there. Is it a matter of time before we have another event? Unfortunately, yes, I think it is. And I don't want to be alarmist. I just want it's a practical summation on the intelligence coming in.
And Dave, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. And Gav, I'm going to get your thoughts on this point as well. Why do you think organizations, entities, agencies silo information? Why don't they want to share? What are some of those reasons that we could surmise? And you've got some intimate knowledge, perhaps or perhaps not. But what's the benefit of not sharing?
Oh, look, I think systems prohibit it sometimes. Let's put it out there. Sometimes the systems, one operating picture would be fantastic. One operating system would be fantastic, both in security and EM. I think a lot of the relationships that are built up in the different agencies are that they're individual relationships. And you really trust some of those people and you don't know some of the others would be the nicest way that I put it. The ones that you really trust, you share straight away. You pick up the phone, do a whole heap of stuff. We've got to promote that working together, joint events, joint task force. And we do that now. We do it for drugs and everything. CT, it's done as well. But all it takes is one little thing to put that out of whack and we swing one way or the other the wrong way. We should always say it's not an individual. It should be an agency or agencies working together. Yeah, look, acknowledge every so often you slip up. Move on, get over it and start sharing again. That's the thing. Don't pull back and hold this information. It's not their information.
Gav, as an expert in your field on priming, framing, leading, and influencing, to what Dave was speaking about there now about relationships, what are some of the hurdles that we're seeing in information not getting to where it needs to be when it needs to be there?
So just kind of extending where Dave was going with that, one of the challenges we've got is anybody who's ever worked in the world of security understands the need to know confidentiality and not oversharing information. I mean, in the security world, we get so focused on it, we refer to operational security as one of those golden things that should be maintained at all times. So I think we need to be careful not to go, hey, everything should be out there, everything should be free. We don't all have the right to know everything because that actually puts a lot of our officers at risk too. But practically, the challenge we've got is not so much that idea of, hold on, everyone should know everything and silos are getting in the way. One of the challenges we've got at the moment is this combination of three variables: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. It's making it harder and harder and harder to actually figure out what Dave and Bella were talking about, those early signals, those early identification pieces that would tell us we need to bring parties in. Equally, Dave mentioned the idea that the system itself can be a challenge in information sharing. Even if we just look at our three layers of government, federal, state, and local, sharing information just across those three layers of government is hard. Never mind the private sector, never mind community security groups, never mind individuals at risk. So, I think if we look at an attack like this and we go, everybody should have seen it coming, we had all the indicators. We did. We really did. But equally, we had a lot of noise, a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation that makes it confusing for individual stakeholders. We also need to acknowledge that our opposition are smart. People who want to cause harm, they have the internet, they have generative AI, the same as all of us. And one of the scary things that happened through COVID was we saw this integration of criminal syndicates with foreign country governments, with terrorist organizations collaborating. Whereas if you look at the way, even just in Australia, government works with private security, it's quite poor. If we look at the way, for example, federal works with state, to Dave's point, I mean, he lived that reality more than me, but I've seen those challenges. When we look at something, for example, like the security of critical infrastructure, we have this challenge of federal legislation versus state drivers. We have this challenge of internal corporate policy versus external regulation. It's not simple. So to close that off, I think one of the things we've got to get back to is effectiveness and outcomes, not just compliance of the driver. If you look at what happened at this attack, chances are each party had enough defensibility in the positions that they had. Whereas you might say, ASIO, we passed on the information to the AFP. The AFP passed it on to New South Wales Police. The communal security groups had a threat picture. Private security might have had a picture but wasn't involved. One of the bigger challenges we've got is actually alignment and acceptance. And that's not a unique Australian problem, but it is a problem we never used to have at this level, and we do have it now. And probably the last challenge there is that, you know, social cohesion is a generic concept that's thrown around as though it's easy to create, easy to sustain. We might not necessarily have had an Islamophobia problem before this attack. We probably do now. We might not necessarily have had the likelihood of copycat attacks, but media coverage means that people with ill intent study what's happened and mimic it. So we've got to be really careful, because we've now seen that violent thought turns to violent deed and can be perpetrated. I think the last part there is we shouldn't forget, and it's clearly articulated in the study, that while this is terrible, and Dave, you were there, you know, 15 people lost their lives, many people were injured. Lots of people have lost the way they will live forever based on this event. In some ways, we're still incredibly lucky. Had those IEDs gone off, we would be talking about hundreds of casualties and many more deaths. So we actually, in some ways, had a near miss. We're lucky. We shouldn't rely on that luck moving forward. We've seen now between the Bondi Beach attack and what happened in WA that IEDs are becoming a favored tool. It's not that this is a new thing, all right? Anybody who's been looking at security for the last 20 years knows it's a problem, but it's a problem here now, not just a theoretical problem. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Gavin. While you've got the mic there, Donovan Crocumps asked a really important question here. And Dave Owens, I want to get your view on this as well. Donovan asked the question, I'm interested in how private or community security groups can be enhanced and enabled to more effectively deployed in a proactive manner to mitigate threat, but also rapid deployment in joint operations with police agencies. Please offer your views.
So this is a good one for Dave and I to tag team. Dave, I'll leave the police discussion for you. But look, practically, let's look at the lens of what we've learned from studying an attack like this. Firstly, we've seen that there was an ineffective overlay of community security and law enforcement. So there were community security volunteers, there were also cops there, but clearly either there was too much activity, there was poor briefing, poor training, poor alignment. You know, on the cop side, you can only imagine the fatigue that most officers are facing, having to have worked almost every weekend on protest duty over and above their other duties. We know that there's fatigue. But some basics. And Donovan, I think one of the things that we need to remember is, even though the world is getting technologically advanced at a rate that we've never seen before, good basics are good basics. Things like controlling the high ground and ensuring that you have visibility over what's happening. Something as simple as going, I have 000 program in speed dial. Something as simple as going, okay, we don't have the adequate law enforcement support. Have I spoken to the regional officer or the local station commander? Have I spoken to who's on duty now? Okay, what can we do around what's happening now with what we have? And we have to change this mindset away from perfect security to adaptive security. In an event like that, from what we could tell from our research, a lot was focused on access control, where there wasn't really the ability to control access anyway. It would have been better to shift to oversight, overwatch, and proactive interaction. And what do I mean by that? If somebody controls the high ground, if they understand what they're looking for, they should have seen the suspicious activity as it was happening, not only when the bullets started coming. Hindsight is 2020, and I'll put that caveat in place. It's very easy to talk when you're not there and you're not under threat. But I think Dave Owens very nicely summarized there was more than enough in terms of early warning indicators for us to have gone, we should have done better collectively. Donovan, the last part there, just before I hand back to David, maybe Bella even wants to jump in on this, is that we have to change this mindset away from the idea of that's the police's job, or that's private security's job, or that's the community's job, or that's federal government's job, and go, safety and security is everyone's responsibility. What are we all going to do about this, and how do we all interact to make this work? Ego, policy, fatigue, stress, all of these things become real variables when we look at on-the-ground deployments. So back to Dave's initial point, we need to build trust and rapport, and we need to get on the same page. Never before, at least in my experience in Australia, almost 2 decades, have I seen it being so important that we start to tear down these private public sector barriers we've created, and we look at real partnerships to tackle the challenges that we're all facing. If we don't do that, we'll just see this happen again, and we'll see blame pointing in different directions. That part doesn't matter. People are going to die. We don't want that to happen. Equally, we have a duty of care and responsibility to our first responders, to our law enforcement officers, and to our security personnel. And if it is a communal security group, usually those are volunteers, which we have an even bigger duty of care to, simply because they're volunteering to put themselves in harm's way. We have a massive collective responsibility to support, train, empower, and do what we can to enable these relationships to work better. And we've got to move away from an us and them siloed mentality. Thanks, Dave.
Dave, you want to add on to that before I bring Bella in, because her part of the research actually focused on some of those early indicators, and that ties in quite nicely with Anonymous's question. But Dave, I just want to get your take on that first before we hand over to Bella.
Yeah, look, I'll be really quick. I actually wrote a paper on this 12 years ago, public-private partnership in security, and that I mean, I was one of the ones guilty of it. Is you've got to understand that private security is not there to replace the police. It's how you can get the best value out of them, and that's why I said it can't be an ad hoc relationship. There's got to be the formal briefings beforehand. There's got to be the shared threat understanding. Now, that's not the intricacies and shared information that's restricted, confidential, all of that, and clear escalation figures. You've got to have triggers. Sorry, you've got to have what you want them to do at certain times. So one of the ways you can do this is about thinking differently and actually include, and I don't know that it's ever happened, is include security. The police run through a lot of joint exercising and joint simulation. So why not do a joint police and security simulation and run through? And people will actually, even at the start of an event, why not do it for 5 to 10 minutes before the event starts and say, okay, this is the situation we've got, security, this is what we'd like you to do. Run them through a tabletop, do it really quickly, because then they actually understand their role. And that's what you want. But also get security to understand, and the police, I don't shy away from that, is strengthen their anomaly recognition. What is different? I think you said before, Dave, if you look twice, trust your gut. If it's telling you something's wrong, something is generally wrong. And then look at what is that structured escalation to the police. You don't want to get them to put their life on the line, but and some have when you look at it, but you want them to know, how do they escalate that? This just does not look right. And then for the police to take it seriously.
Awesome. Thank you. Bella, just to bring you in on that point, a lot of your work focused on some of those threat indicators that Gavin was alluding to and what Anonymous is asking. What were some of those significant signals that, in hindsight, and noting that hindsight is 20/20 vision, we understand that, which should have really pulled some triggers to lead to different actions sooner?
Thanks, Dave. It's actually a really important question because when you look back, the signals were actually there, but I'd group the most significant ones into three areas. Firstly, there was a very clear escalation in both volume and severity of incidents. We weren't just seeing more anti-Semitic activity, we were seeing a shift from things like graffiti and intimidation to arson, fire bombings, and threats of mass violence. That kind of escalation is a classic warning sign that the environment is becoming more permissive to violence. Secondly, the nature of the target changed. There was a move towards highly symbolic and communal targets. That should tell you that this isn't random. It reflects ideological signaling and grievance being directed at identity-based targets, which is a key risk indicator for broader violence. And finally, I think this is the most overlooked piece, which was the normalization of hostile narratives. Across online platforms, activist spaces, and even parts of mainstream discourse, you saw increasingly aggressive rhetoric becoming legitimized. And when that kind of language becomes normal, it lowers the behavioral threshold for individuals to act. So in hindsight, the issue wasn't actually a lack of signals, it was how those signals were interpreted. They were often treated as isolated hate incidents rather than being recognized collectively as part of an escalating pattern with clear risk implications.
And this really refers to the dots that Dave was talking about in the very beginning. So absolutely is how do we collect these dots? Now, I can't believe I've just looked at the time and we're literally at the back end of it. We could carry on this webinar for easily another hour. But I'm going to throw this out to the panel and Gav, I'm going to start with you, right? What is one practical change that organizations could implement now that would materially improve preparedness?
Teach security awareness at an individual level. If people don't know how to scan their own environment, assess what could hurt them, come up with a plan to stop that from hurting them, and be able to implement that plan or communicate, and they're relying on the organization to do that for them, then there's an intrinsic layer of vulnerability. The organization's job is to do that on scale, but work from home, work from anywhere, people are displaying different work habits than we saw before. We need to make sure that people's capability to keep themselves and their families safe is something we build into ourselves. Not easy to do, does require a change of thinking, but if we don't do that, the way you respond under something scary or threatening is absolutely random. Might be the right thing, might be the wrong thing. Let's move away from something random and move to something actual. You know me, Dave, I can never only stop at one, and you ask for one, but I have to give more. Dave Owens is laughing, he knows me. But the other piece is get good at doing proper risk and threat assessments. And not the tick the box, I've done this so that I can, provide CYA and protect my butt if something goes wrong. Actually look and go, where, if somebody wanted to hurt me, could they hurt me? As an organization. If we're putting on an event, it's not good enough to go, well, the last 10 events, nothing went wrong. You need to look at each event. You need to look at who's coming. You need to look at what the purpose is. You need to look at what could go wrong. And we need to think about these things in advance. And then we need to have the responsibility and the accountability to actually prevent what is preventable and plan for what is not. And if we don't do that, then we land up always being reactive. We have no ability to disrupt early, and prevention is wishful thinking. So both of those, we need to start from the organizational level and the individual level, and hopefully these things marry up. Thanks, Dave.
Dave Owens?
Yeah, look, mine's very similar to Gab's. I think you've got to do, we've got to not accept that this is the norm anymore, because what we've done is we've just made this massive leap to we're accepting a new norm. And I don't think that's good. I don't think it's a good norm. You've got to be aware of your surroundings without being threatened by the surroundings. That's really, really the most important thing. And I think if anything can come out of it is the working together, the integration of private security and the police. accepting and have a role, very clear role defined to play. And that integration would see some massive steps forward. It would make it so much a harder target.
And again, it's what you both said. This is not about talking. This is not about having discussions. This is not about building new frameworks. This is about actually doing. Bella, your thoughts.
Yeah.
What is one thing that you believe that organizations can do now?
First of all, I think organizations could be doing a lot more than one. So maybe I could just quickly break down 3 very quick things, if that's okay. But firstly, I think it's very important to have a regular rhythm of reviewing the environment. So this could even be like a quick weekly check-in to ask what's actually changed and how does this affect us? I think it's really important to actually review our current environment today. Secondly, I think linking intelligence to clear triggers for action. So if you see escalation or targeting, it actually leads to something, as we have seen, whether that's increased security, increased awareness, or just adjustments on the ground. And third, I think it's very easy to dismiss one incident, but if you're tracking trends over time, it becomes much easier to justify adjusting your posture early. So finally, I think making sure intelligence is actually shared and understood across the entire organization is imperative, so the right people can actually respond. And that really is about moving from collecting information to actively using it to drive small, timely adjustments in how one operates.
Thanks, Bella. And, unfortunately within security, or fortunately within security, the reward for doing security well is loss of budget, loss of resources, because nothing bad happens. So it's very difficult to manage how you're doing things well. So I don't want to be having this discussion in 5 years' time saying, we've done all these things well, so nothing's happened. So, that's more of a proactive discussion. But what I definitely don't want to be doing is having a discussion in 5 years' time saying we haven't progressed, we haven't learned, we're still having the same discussions 5 years on. So, Gav, if I could just get a final thought from you before we close off. What would you like to see? What does good look like to you? Fast forward, and I'm not even going to say 5 years because I think 5 years is too long. In 2 years, what does good look like, or even next year, what does good look like to you to prove that we've genuinely learned and changed behaviors from this event?
So let's also be cognizant that we've got the Olympics coming in 2032. So we've got high profile, high intensity activity coming our way. We actually don't have the luxury of waiting too long or taking too long if we want to make sure that we can actually deliver something like that safely and securely in the new threat context. So my request is actually let's not wait. There are many, many levers that can be pulled and many things that can happen. It's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be, okay, now we automatically have allocated a bit more budget to security, so it should be fine. Because if that budget's not spent properly or not allocated based on threat or not aligned with effective deterrence or mitigation, you might just be wasting money. So I noted just before the questions came down, there was a comment about should Home Affairs take over security regulation? We need to be asking questions like that because clearly our existing systems are not bringing the best outputs into the way we secure Australia. It's hard to change legislative structures, but we should be doing this work, and we should be doing this work continuously based on what's happening around us. Let's not wait for this to only happen at a federal or state government level. Look at what you can do for your team, for your organization. If you're somebody that leads an organization, let's not just sit there and pray that everything's going to be okay and then potentially get frustrated when it's not. Own it. The world is not going to get safer, and it's not going to get easier to navigate in the short term. If we can own both of those things, we can work very well to prevent them. Equally, for those who haven't looked at the case study of the broken windows and zero tolerance approach that was applied in New York, we actually have to have a strong change of perspective within Australia if we want to be able to return to a very safe, very mundane norm. And that probably will start with a broken window, zero tolerance approach Otherwise, we're not going to get cut through. My request is that our authorities and everyone else needs to have the commitment to be able to do something like that, not just make it a policy that's on paper, but it actually has to be followed through. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Gav. Dave Owens, final thought from you, sir.
No, look, I think, the report is very, very good. It's systems based, it's not individual blame, and it's about actually doing something, getting something done and movement on this, not just sitting stagnant and saying, I will wait for the Royal Commission in 7 months, because I don't know how many reviews and commissions I've done where the first thing we do is we go back, we get all the recommendations and we go, what was enacted, what was done? You go, well, there's your recommendations, because nothing was done. Something has to be done moving forward, and that's everybody's responsibility. It's not mine, it's not yours, it's everybody's.
And how good would that be if the Royal Commission came out whenever it comes out and said, yep, we've changed that, we've done this, we've already implemented this, etc., etc. These are the things that we can find. Great takeaway. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Bella, final thought and final takeaway before we close off.
I think it's basically everything I've already said, but just reiterating that everybody, regardless of what industry, needs to have a forward-thinking and reactive mindset, proactive mindset, not reactive. And I've noticed that a lot in the security industry. We are brilliant at reacting, and what I would like to see more in certainly our country and globally is more of a proactive, forward-thinking approach, because as Gav said, security is just going to get worse. The world is a dangerous place. So my key takeaway is, after writing this report, I would really like to see more change in the way our environments are with a proactive mindset around security.
We've got a term for that, Bella. We call it presilience. Awesome. So before we close off, I want to come back to where we started. This was not theoretical. This was not abstract. This was very, very real. And it happened here, and it changed lives. What we heard today, from intelligence to operations, from leadership, points to something very, very clear. The risk was not invisible. The signals were there. The challenge is not the challenge was not in what happened next. And that's the part we all own. Because whether you're in government, law enforcement, private security, leadership, or any other organization responsible for people, the question no longer is, could this happen? The question is, if it did, again, what would we do differently tomorrow? That's what this research is about. It's not about hindsight. It's not about it is about responsibility. And it's about closing a gap between knowing and doing. Because in the moments that matter most, there's no time to interpret, debate, or second guess. There's only action. And the quality of that action is shaped long before the event even occurs. So this is the opportunity in front of all of us now to think differently, to act earlier, to challenge assumptions, and to build capability that is real, not just documented. If today has prompted even one shift in how you think about preparedness, decision-making, or risk, then we've done our job. I encourage all of you to take the next step. Download the research paper, spend time with it, challenge it, and apply it in your own context. If you want to go deeper, if this is something that matters to your organization, we welcome the opportunity to engage further with you through a dedicated briefing session tailored to your environment, your risks, and your people. Because ultimately, this isn't about a report. It's about outcomes. It's about ensuring that what we learn actually changes what we do. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Gav, Dave, and Bella, again for joining us. Thank you to you, our audience, for joining us. Thank you to all the contributors for this important piece of work. And thank you all for giving of your time to join us. And on that note, we say goodbye.